Hello everyone, today we'll be doing a reading from the history of Ukraine, and we'll be talking about Ukrainianization. Despite Bolshevik provinces made during the Civil War to respect the principle of national self-determination, and despite the formation of nationally based Soviet republics, and ostensibly federal structure of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party still lacked meaningful support among the non-Russians during the early years of its rule. It remained a tiny and overwhelmingly Russian urban-based organization that perched precariously atop uncertain masses of peasants and non-Russians of dubious loyalty. Ukraine, in particular, as Stalin himself openly acknowledged, was a weak point of Soviet power. Therefore, over-appeasing the peasants with the NEP and the party initiated to win the acceptance and broaden support among the non-Russians. In 1923, the 12th Party Congress Party leadership embarked on a policy of indigenization, or taking roots, or Ukrainianization. It was a called effort to recruit non-Russians into the party and state apparatus, for Soviet officials to learn and use local languages, and for state support for cultural development among the nationalities. The Ukrainian version of this was called Ukrainianization. Before Ukrainianization could be implemented, however, changes had to be made to the party leadership in Ukraine. As it stood, the leadership consisted of Soviet officials, of Russians, Great Russians, and Jews. By and large, they showed little understanding for Ukrainianization and even less inclined for putting it into effect. Indeed, many of them made a point of espousing Russian superiority over the locals. For example, one of the highest officials of the Ukrainian party, Dmitry Lebed, was Russian, who made no effort to conceal his hostility to the Ukrainian language, customs, and Ukrainianization in general. He inculcated the theory of struggle of the two cultures, which held that because Russian culture in Ukraine was associated with the progressive proletariat in the city, and while Ukrainian culture was tied to the backward peasantry and the countryside, Russian culture inevitably triumphed, and it was duty of communists to support this natural process. Although Lebed's ideas were shared by many of his superiors in Moscow, they were considered ultimately, he and a number of prominent non-Ukrainian parties were recalled. Their posts were filled by loyal, disciplined representatives of Moscow, such as Legar Konovich, a Ukrainian Jew who took over the leadership party of the apparatus in Ukraine and was ready to follow the party's line on Ukrainianization, or else by Ukrainians who sincerely wanted Ukrainianization to succeed. Among the latter were Vlad Chubar, who replaced Rozovsky as head of the Ukrainian Soviet government, Alexander Shimsky, a former botanist who assumed responsibility for the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, and the ubiquitous old Bolshevik Mikhail Shupernik, who became Commissar of Justice, only after the hardline Russian bureaucrats and chauvinists, as Levin called them, were removed from their posts as the Ukrainian Soviet government ready to implement the new policy. The first measures introduced under Ukrainianization policy were aimed at expanding the use of Ukrainian, particularly in the party and the government. The need for doing so was, in 1922, for every member of the Ukrainian party to regularly use Ukrainian. 7 functioned only in Russian, and the government ratio was 1:3. In order to deal with this imbalance, government party officials were instructed in August 1923 to take specially organized Ukrainian language courses. Those who failed them completely successfully were threatened by dismissal, and by 1925 bureaucrats received instructions to use Ukrainian in all government correspondence and publications. And in 1927, Kaganovich declared that all party business was to be conducted in Ukrainian. Despite the notable lack of enthusiasm among non-Ukrainians in the government and party, the new policy produced impressive results. Whereas in 1922 only 20% of the government business was conducted in Ukrainian, by 1927 the figure rose to 70%. And at that time the number of Ukrainians in political establishment of the republic decreased. In 1923 only 35% of the government employees and 23% of the party members were Ukrainian, but by 1926 to 27 the respective percentages rose from 54 to 52%. Although they had gained a majority in both organizations as newcomers, Ukrainians were largely concentrated in the lower levels of government and party. In the late 1920s, the representation in the party's central committee was more than 25%. The Ukrainianization drive penetrated all aspects of life in Soviet Ukraine and its greatest impact on education. Unlike the Tsarist regime, the Soviets placed a high priority on education, and their achievements in this area were truly impressive. Several factors helped explain the Soviet emphasis on education. From an ideological viewpoint, Soviet society had to be well educated to serve as a model for the new program, and furthermore, an educated populace greatly increased from productive capacity and the power of the state, and finally educated provided excellent opportunities for indoctrinating the new generation with Soviet values. Most dramatic were the Soviet strides in elimination of illiteracy. At the time of revolution, about 40% of the urban population was illiterate, and 10 years later that rose to 70%. In the countryside, literacy rate at this time rose from 15% to over 50%. And because a massive education drive was conducted in Ukrainian, the spread of education meant the spread of Ukrainianization amongst the country's youth. The driving force behind Ukrainianization of the school system was the Commissar of Education from 1927 to 1933. Working with an obsessive zeal, he was able to announce in 1929 the high point of Ukrainianization, that over 80% of general education schools and 55% of vocational schools and 30% of Ukrainian university level students offered instruction in Ukrainian only. Over 97% of Ukrainian children were taught in their native tongue. The Russian and Jewish minorities had the opportunity to study in Russian, but were expected to take some courses in Ukrainian. Before the revolution, the Ukrainian schools were practically non-existent. Ukrainophiles could only have dreamed of such conditions a decade later. Skripal made them a reality. The success of the measures was more imposing the view of the difficulties, and particularly the lack of qualified teachers. The Ukrainianization program called for 100,000 teachers, and only about 45,000 were available. In desperation, Skripal attempted to import several thousand teachers from Galicia, but he failed to get Moscow's permission, and perhaps because of the Soviet fear of Galicians' highly developed national consciousness. Also, many textbooks were still unavailable. Another problem, evident especially at the university level, was the refusal by many Russians who constituted the majority of facilities to use the peasant language for purpose of higher education. Professor Tolstoy in Odessa expressed an attitude when he commented, "I consider all comrades to have switched lecturing in the Ukrainian language as renegades." Nevertheless, even in the universities, Ukrainian students became the majority. The rapid Ukrainianization of the schools gave rise to a general move of national optimism, which the writer Boris Ankonovich captured in the moment. In the march of the millions on their way to the Ukrainian school, he could see the fire of a great revival. This the same way the revival was evident in Ukrainian language media, which had been harshly repressed by the Tsarist regime and treated poorly in the early years of Soviet rule. In 1922, only 27% of books published in Ukraine appeared in Ukrainian, and there were fewer than 10 newspapers and periodicals in that language. By 1927, well over 50% of new books appeared on Ukrainian. In 1933, 426 newspapers in the Republic and 373 were in the native language. Largely as a result of Skripal's complaints about the Red Army acted as an agent of Russification, Ukrainian was introduced into officer training schools and a large reserve of units on Ukraine. There are even plans to reorganize the army on a territorial basis. Surprisingly, such as well-known non-Ukrainian commanders in the Red Army, as Mikhail Ferenczy and Iona Ikir, supported these projects. For Ukrainianization to achieve long-lasting results, it had to break the Russian cultural monopoly in the cities. The socioeconomic changes that took place in the 1920s and 30s encouraged Ukrainians to believe such a result was possible. The Soviets' vast industrializational drive, launched in 1928, created a great need for urban workers. Simultaneously, collectivization policies in the countryside forced many peasants from the land. Consequently, masses of Ukrainian peasants poured into the cities, greatly altering the ethnic composition of the proletariat and urban population as a whole. Kharkiv, Luhansk, and Dnipropetrovsk had constituted about 38.7% and 60% of their populations, respectively. 10 years later, these percentages had increased to 50, 31, and 48%, and by the mid-1930s, Ukrainians were the majority in most large cities. And they were encouraged by the Ukrainianization programs to retain their native language later rather than to adopt Russian, as had previously done. It seemed, therefore, that in Ukraine, as elsewhere in Eastern Europe, the culture and language of the rural majority was going to overwhelm that of the urban minority. The successful policy of Ukrainianization, which did not go as far as Skropotnik and his associates, of which was the first result of the first foremost that was linked to the general process of modernization. It was not primarily patriotism or traditionalism that caused Ukrainians to retain their native language, but it was because, better than other language, Ukrainian allowed them to obtain an education and to obtain useful information from their newspapers and books, to communicate with officials, and to perform their jobs. Because of the Ukrainianization programs, Ukrainian language and culture became a romantic, esoteric obsession of a tiny intelligentsia, or a hallmark of the backward peasantry. Instead, Ukrainian was well on its way to becoming the primary means of communication and expressions of modernizing industrialized society.